This may be the oddest brew day we've done. We're making Keptinis, a traditional Lithuanian style of beer, where the mash is baked in the oven, the hops are summarized as a tea, and the beer is a raw ale, meaning no boil. To guide us through this process is Brülosophy contributor Alex Shanks-Abel. How did this Keptinis turn out, and how close did Alex get to burning down their kitchen? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by Great Fermentations. More on them in a bit. Okay, Alex, tell me, how on earth did you come across this beer style?
I'm sure, like a lot of people, we follow people like Lars Marius Garshall in particular, who is the man who kind of brought us Quake beer, Kveik, whatever you want to call it. While Lars was traveling Europe, Norway in particular, he made a stop in Lithuania to check out what those people were doing. He actually traveled to northeast Norway and watched a brew day with an individual, Vaitatis, and his son, Ignas. This 2018 blog, he is kind of the basis for what I think most of us think of as Keptinis.
Yeah, and Lars describes this as a dark beer made with pale malts where the color comes from the baking of the mash, which that part's pretty crazy. Now, in normal dark beers, he says the color comes from drying the malts at high temperature, and the heat makes the starch and protein in the malts go through the Maillard reactions, producing the color and roasty flavors. But in this beer, it was the mash that had been baked. What went through the Maillard reactions was mostly sugar, not starch, so of course the flavor wouldn't be the same. So, I mean, I have to ask you, Alex, why do you want to brew this one?
I have to admit that the idea of baking a beer for 4 hours and stinking up the whole house was extremely appealing to me.
Totally. So we've got a ton of footage of your brew day. So let's go through it, and let's start with the water.
I just collected some RO water for a few hours, collecting 6.5 gallons, I believe, and basically added just a pinch of calcium chloride and gypsum just to give it a little bit of acidity. Unlike other brew days, this water was just going to sit around during the mashing process, just kind of being used as a reservoir.
Right, and if we talk about your mash bill, not too complicated for this one?
Well, to start with, it's 100% Pilsner malt. End to end, it's 100% Pilsner malt.
You got your grain, you milled it up, and now it's time to perform the mash, which appears to involve a bunch of aluminum foil trays.
I just went to my local HEB, local grocery store, and grabbed these kind of aluminum trays that you would typically use around Thanksgiving for roasting a turkey. Back in 2018, I used pretty small trays, just because I wanted to ensure that the grain would have as much interaction with the oven as possible. But as I learned back then, that results in a pretty pitch black beer because too much of the grain gets burnt from the roasting process. So this time around, I opted for grabbing the largest, the deepest trays that could fit in my oven.
It looks like you put in around 3.5 pounds of grain in each one of these trays?
Yeah, exactly. Just tried to keep it as consistent as possible, filling them up about halfway with the milled grain.
Yeah, so talk me through adding the water to these trays.
So that RO water reservoir that we had, I kept it at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, just a little bit of a simmer inside of my all-in-one unit. Poured out the grains onto these 4 trays, filled them about halfway up, and just grabbed a Pyrex cup, dipped it into the simmering RO water, and poured it slowly over the grain, stirring it with a wooden paddle, basically just until it had kind of this thick oatmeal consistency. It's pretty important that you don't make the thing too soupy, because basically you'll just be boiling the grains inside of the oven if it's too moist.
It must smell fantastic in your kitchen at this point.
In 2018, it smelled horrible. However, I can say in 2024, it smelled fantastic. Just the grain starts out as having a little bit of a toasty aroma, and over the course of 4 hours, it becomes much more of a rich, caramelly, raisiny aroma that fills the entire house.
So tell me about the baking process. Presumably you preheat the oven to a certain temperature and then in they go?
Back in 2018, I put my oven on full blast at 500 degrees, added the grains, and about 10 minutes later, I had to open all the windows. So learning that lesson this time around, I set the oven simply at 350 degrees to get the grains to have much more of a focus on the caramelization process and less on the roasting and the burning notes. I can happily say that this time around I had nothing even closely coming to a fire.
Now, when you pulled the trays out, I see you used a thermometer, and it was pretty hot in there, 210 Fahrenheit?
Yeah, and that's kind of what relating to before, not wanting it to be too moist, because it'll be even cooler than that if the mash, if we'll call it that, in the oven is going to be too moist, it'll be too cool. But yeah, thankfully it's at 210, it's basically boil at a rolling boil inside of this oatmeal mash the whole time. Thankfully not getting above those temperatures, or yeah, we would start risking that smoke.
Yes, so then you took that and you added it into your boil kettle. It still maintained a bit of liquid, right? It was somewhat easy to get it in?
Yeah, I just kind of broke it up with that spoon. It was still pretty wet, pretty moist when I was breaking it up. And I believe that when I broke it up and added it to the kettle and later drained it, it didn't seem like the grains absorbed any moisture. They just kind of had a neutral effect on the overall volume of the kettle.
I got to ask, did you give it a little taste?
Well, I have to admit that I stuck my finger in there and gave it a taste about 5 times. I have to admit it was absolutely fantastic. It just kind of tasted like eating a kind of like the smell, a caramel raisiny oatmeal, granted still with a little bit of sharp bits from the barley hull. But I could have snacked on that thing all day.
So you needed to add some water now to perform the boil. So how did you figure out what to do here? How much water to add and what temperature?
I just kind of kept the water that I had from that the reservoir before. I believe it was about pretty much exactly 5.5 gallons remaining after scooping all the grain. So all I did was dump in the grain, and I was lucky enough that the grain just had a total neutral effect. It didn't add any water, it didn't absorb any water.
So that's the mash, and you're, 5 hours into your brew day at this point?
Yes, it was an all-day process.
But we're about to get to adding the hops, which is also an interesting process. But before we get to that, let's mention just quickly today's sponsor, and that's Great Fermentations. Family owned and operated for more than 25 years, Great Fermentations offer a huge range of brewing supplies and equipment. Great Fermentations are well known for their top-notch customer service, which I can fully attest to. Great Fermentations offer the ability to custom build your malt bills in fractional amounts, so you're not forced to order full pound increments when you only need a half or quarter pound of something. And shipping is free on most orders over $59. Check them out at greatfermentations.com. Okay, Alex, tell me about your hop schedule.
Keptinis is a raw ale, which means that we never actually bring the wort up to a boil. And oftentimes in raw ales, you don't add hops to the boil, for the simple reason that you're not going to get isomerization. So taking about a liter of that hot RO water that we had, added it to a small saucepan, brought that up to a boil, and just dumped the hops in and created this nice, thick, green, sludgy slurry that I boiled away for I believe 20 minutes. Took that mixture and dumped it into the that pot of now wort.
But then you needed to chill the wort down before adding yeast. Was there anything special there?
I kind of employ something of a pseudo no-chill method for most of my non-experiment beers, where I take all of that wastewater that I had from filtering the RO water and just fill up basically a brute bucket. So I took my fermentation keg and just dropped it inside of that bucket and let it cool for a couple hours before moving it to the fermentation chamber.
Now tell me about the yeast pitch.
Yeah, so I opted to go with a clean yeast like Vitatis does, using AO7 Flagship, which is their Chico strain. And I also saw that there was a note in Lars's blog where he mentions that the brewers like to take the wort, or the beer rather, when it's not fully fermented, and move it into a cask and kind of do a secondary fermentation, spunding type thing. So I opted just to ferment this thing under pressure to kind of replicate that process to an extent.
I wish I had the beer with me right now so I could try it with you, but tell me, how did this thing turn out?
When you try this beer for the first time, your mind just can't quite figure it out. It's, of course, got this really intense, earthy, caramelly sweetness to it, but unlike a beer that maybe would use a ton of crystal malts, it doesn't linger around. This kind of sweetness is just simply washes away. It doesn't linger. As somebody at the homebrew shop mentioned, it kind of has this super decoction flavor, which I think is probably the best way to describe it. It just has this really intense malty complexity that isn't quite like anything I've ever tried.
Sounds so intriguing. Now, so I have to ask, if you had the opportunity, would you brew one of these again?
I waited about 6 years between 2018 and 2024, making it a second time. But I think after this most recent time, it came out just exactly the way that I would like. It matched the descriptions that I saw online from Lars and others, and I don't think I'm going to wait another 6 years to do this again.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking us through this pretty crazy recipe. I'm so pleased you didn't burn your house down. A little fire for the footage would have been great, but it's good that the house is still standing. Now, if you want to see more tips from Alex, particularly related to some pretty thrifty attempts to make brewing a little cheaper and easier, then you'll be very interested in this video here.